Hello, my friend. Today I will tell you another long-forgotten legend. Close your eyes and let the magic transport you to Middle-earth. Our journey begins in the age before endings, when the stars still sang their slow songs over the hills of Middle-earth, and the rivers knew the names of the trees. There walked a gray wanderer beneath the boughs of the world. His hat was tall and weather-worn, his cloak the color of twilight mists, and in his hand he carried a staff carved with runes as old as the sky. He was Gandalf the Grey, friend of the free peoples, kindler of courage, and bearer of a quiet power that needed no crown to rule. He was no ordinary man, no mere wizard of trickery and sparks. He was a Maya, spirit sent from beyond the circles of the world by the Valor, guardians of Arda, to guide and protect, never to dominate. And so he walked century upon century through wild lands and war-torn cities, whispering wisdom into the ears of kings and children alike. He was the flame that never sought the hearth, the hand that gave without grasping. But the world was darkening. Far in the east, in the land where shadows had teeth, the Dark Lord Sauron stirred once more. The one ring his vassal of dominion had long been lost, cut from his finger in the fires of rebellion. But it was not destroyed. It lingered still, a shard of his soul singing out across the centuries. And it had been found by chance, by fate, by the smallest of hands in a land of green fields and round doors. A hobbit had it now, Frodo, gentle-hearted and small as a whisper. The ring, ever watchful, waited for its master, or another who might be seduced. Its will was subtle, and it spun its lies in voices that echoed with truth. And so came the council in Rivendell, beneath the elven stars and waterfalls that wept with memory. Elves, dwarves, men, and hobbits gathered, and there, amid fire, light, and ancient songs, a decision was made. The ring must be destroyed, cast into the very fires that forged it into the heart of Mount Doom. Gandalf knew the peril. He had counseled against using it, against even holding it. Its power was too great, its lure too deep. He had seen its shadow flicker behind the eyes of great ones, Boromir, proud and noble, Galadriel, wise and radiant. Even Saruman, once the head of their order, now fallen to ruin. And yet, there was a moment, a quiet moment, almost lost in the passage of days, when Frodo stumbled, weeping under the weight of the ring's burden. They were high in the passes of the misty mountains then, snow falling in weary silence, and the road ahead seemed endless. Frodo held out the ring to Gandalf, eyes pleading. "Take it," he whispered. "I cannot bear it." And Gandalf, for a heartbeat, hesitated. What if he took it not to wield it, but to keep it safe, to spare Frodo's spirit from its gnawing teeth? He had resisted before. He had spoken of the terror it would unleash through him. "With that power, I should have become a Dark Lord," he had said once, voice heavy with fear. But beautiful and terrible as the dawn. But the world was breaking, and he was so very tired. So he reached out, and in that single breath, the fate of Middle East changed forever. The ring slid onto his palm like a drop of molten gold, warm and pulsing. It did not resist him. No, it welcomed him, whispered to him, wrapped around his thoughts like silk spun from stars. He gasped, staggered, but did not drop it. In the windless hush of the mountain, a voice rose, Not aloud, not spoken, but inside him, coiling through the chambers of his spirit. You would save them all, it said. You would end the war in a day. No more death, no more fear. Let them follow you. Let them kneel in peace. And Gandalf, old, weary, aching with love for the world, listened. He did not speak of what he felt then. He merely closed his fist around the ring and smiled at Frodo, gently placing a hand upon the hobbit's head. "Rest, my friend," he said. "Your burden is mine now." They descended the mountain in silence, and none could see the first silver strand of shadow that trailed behind the gray pilgrim, curling like smoke in the snow. As days passed, the world did not change all at once. The sky did not fall, nor did the stars weep blood. Gandalf was still himself, still kind, still watchful. He laughed with Merry and Pippin, spoke with wisdom to Aragorn, and walked with light steps through the woods of Lothrings. But something in him had shifted. Galadriel saw it. She who bore Na Ring of Water felt the ripples in the currents of the world. She watched Gandalf with ancient eyes, saw the gleam of steel behind his gaze, and knew. When they spoke, she did not name it, but her voice trembled with mourning, as though for a friend already gone in the quiet of Cascaladon, under trees that shimmered like green starlight. She offered him a choice. "You may still set it down," she whispered. "It has not bound you yet." Gandalf smiled softly with sorrow. "I do not wear it," he said. "It wears me." And the lady wept. The ring did not corrupt him as it did others. It knew better. It wrapped itself in his purpose, in his deepest yearning. It fed not on greed, but on compassion, on the need to save, to protect, to preserve. In doing so, it drew him ever closer to ruin. He began to speak of unity, not alliance, but order, a world under one will. No more councils, no more fragile kings, just peace, unquestioned, unbreakable. At first, they listened. He was Gandalf, after all, beloved, trusted. But slowly the world began to tremble. A Florian lay like a dream, folded into the waking world. A stillness wrapped in gold and green, where time moved as gently as a falling leaf, and the past walked hand in hand with the present. The light here did not merely shine, it caressed, bathing every leaf and stone in the soft luminance of an unsetting sun. It was an ancient light, filtered through the long memory of trees that had stood since the elder days. And it touched the hearts of those who entered, as if whispering, "Be still and remember who you were before the world taught you fear." When Gandalf walked those paths, the mallow leaves did not rustle with the same welcome they once had. The branches arched above him like the ribs of some great cathedral, their leaves trembling with windless foreboding. The air was thick with silence, not the restful hush of elven contemplation, but the kind that presses against the bones, a silence that seems to hold its breath and wait for something to break. He stood by the mirror of Galadriel beneath the starry canopy, where the pool reflected more than just the sky. Galadriel had summoned him, but not as an equal, not this time. She had stood tall and sorrowful beneath the silver limbs of the trees, and when she turned her gaze upon him, it was as though the very forest flinched. "You carry it now," she said, her voice soft, but laced with an unbearable gravity, like the hush before a storm. Gandalf did not meet her eyes at first. Instead, He looked into the mirror's depths, where the water stirred of its own accord. The reflection there was not his face, but a shadow of it. Eyes that had once twinkled with secret joy, now glinting like ice under moonlight. Lips drawn in a line that bespoke command rather than kindness. He finally turned to her, and when he spoke, his voice was gentle, but with a strength beneath it. A steel that had not been there before. "I carry it," he said, "because the world can no longer afford to stumble forward in blindness, hoping that the darkness will grow weary and depart. I have seen the enemy's mind, Galadriel. I have heard the drums of his will echoing in the deep places of the earth. He does not sleep, he does not doubt, and he does not hesitate." Galadriel's face was lit from beneath by the glow of the mirror, and in her ancient eyes swam sorrow too deep for tears. "And yet," she replied slowly, the words curling like leaves in autumn wind, "you speak now as he once did. Do you not remember how Sauron began with a promise of order, with a vision of peace? He did not raise towers of flame in the beginning. He built fair forms, offered gifts, taught craft. He whispered that which the wise already feared, that freedom without guidance leads to ruin." Gandalf's brow furrowed, and for a moment the hand that gripped his staff loosened, as though the memory of who he had been struggled to resurface. The light of the ring pulsed faintly through the folds of his robe, a heartbeat beneath the words, and the air shimmered faintly like heat rising from stones. "I am not he," Gandalf said. "Sauron sought to rule all wills, to bind them to his own out of hunger and pride. I seek not to consume, but to protect. I will not burn the world to build it anew. I will preserve what is beautiful and root out what is poisonous." Galadriel stepped closer, and the forest seemed to hush with her movement. Her voice, when it came again, was tender and piercing. "But do you not see Mithrand? That is the lie. It tells you that preservation and domination are the same when wrapped in the right cause. That if you speak gently, no one will hear the chains. It feeds on your love for this world, until even that becomes a blade." A long silence followed, broken only by the sigh of distant leaves and the silver tinkle of a waterfall far beyond the trees. Gandalf looked up into the canopy where the stars glittered faintly between the branches, and his thoughts, ever stormy now, turned inward. Was she right? He wondered. Had he already begun to lose the edge of who he was, like stone worn by a river? Or was this the cost of clarity? Had the world not grown too fragile, too blind to save itself without a firmer hand? Could one not guide gently but firmly, like a shepherd with a crook rather than a sword? He thought of Frodo and the weight that had once hung around the hobbit's neck like a stone, pulling him down into despair. He thought of the trembling in Frodo's hands, the way his voice had become thinner, like parchment crumbling in fire. The ring had been killing him slowly. Was it not a mercy to take it, to bear the agony for him? Still, there was something else. A chill at the edge of every thought, a voice beneath his voice. Not command, not yet, but the beginning of something that watched and waited. It was subtle, patient, coiled like a serpent in the hollows of his mind. The ring had not shown him fire and tyranny. It had shown him unity, purpose, salvation. Galadriel touched the surface of the water, breaking the image. Ripples spilled outward, distorting stars and shadows alike. Her voice was barely more than a breath. You still have the strength to let it go. And Gandalf, after a long pause, answered with a whisper that seemed to carry on the wind for leagues. "I do not know if I have the will." Then he turned, and the leaves rustled faintly, though there was no breeze. The trees did not bow as he passed. They shivered, and Galadriel stood alone by the mirror, her hand trembling slightly at her side. As he left the woods of Lothlorien, the land itself seemed to shift. The golden light dimmed ever so slightly, as though a cloud had passed unseen overhead. The birdsong grew hesitant. The rivers murmured a different tune, still beautiful, but with a strange dissonance, like a harp string drawn too tight. Aragorn, waiting by the riverbank with the others, looked up as Gandalf approached. The ranger's eyes, ever watchful, flickered with unease, though his face remained still. "You were long in council," he said. Gandalf nodded, eyes distant. "Galadriel sees more than she says." "She always has," Aragorn replied, then paused. "And what did she say of the ring?" Gandalf's answer was slow, measured, as though spoken through the leaves of memory. "She asked whether I would lay it down, and I told her the truth that I do not know." Aragorn's gaze did not falter, but something in him, some ancestral intuition perhaps, tightened. He saw in Gandalf now the same man who had once stood with him upon the broken bridge of Khazad-dûm, defying the fire with only his staff and his will. But he also saw something new, a gravity that bent the air, a silence that swallowed words before they could form. Gandalf walked past him, and the world felt just a little heavier in his wake. The fellowship moved eastward, their feet pressed into the softening soil of Lothorin's borders for the last time, crossing from dream to waking world, as surely as if they were passing between two separate realities. The trees behind them stood like memory itself, golden sentinels whispering in the high language of wind, their branches reluctant to release those who had walked beneath their watch. The air grew cooler with each step toward the Unduin, and the murmur of the river grew louder, as if it too was eager to remind them that the world beyond was not a place of starlight and stillness, but of rushing time and the swift march of fate. They camped by the riverbank that night, where the reeds shivered beneath a moon thin as a whispered secret. The sky had turned a pale, washed blue, veiled with drifting clouds like gauze, and the stars blinked uncertainly, as if hesitating to shine their full light upon the world. There was a quiet to the camp, but not a restful one. It was the quiet that precedes a question no one dares to ask, the kind that stretches between people when too much remains unsaid. Gandalf sat apart from the others, his back resting lightly against the wide trunk of an ancient willow whose roots curled into the river like old hands. The water glinted in the moonlight, silver threads unfurling through black silk. His staff lay across his knees, and his hand hovered over it, but did not touch. His eyes, those once warm, twinkling lanterns of comfort, were cast toward the horizon, and they seemed deeper now, like wells in which stars drowned and vanished. Aragorn approached without sound, as he was wont to do, the hem of his weathered cloak trailing softly over the moss. He paused a few paces away, observing Gandalf, not as one might observe a friend, but as one might watch a statue shift when no one is looking, uncertain if what they've seen is real. "You do not sleep," Aragorn said finally, his voice a low thrum meant not to disturb, but to resonate. Like a note plucked from a harp whose strings remember older songs. Gandalf's lips twitched faintly at the corners, but he did not smile. "Sleep is a gentle gait," he said, "and I no longer know what waits behind it." Aragorn lowered himself beside the old wizard, folding his legs with the slow deliberation of one whose every movement was steeped in thought. The fire from the camp behind them was dim, casting only the faintest glimmers through the boughs, and the night around them pressed close, not with threat, but with a kind of expectancy, as though it were listening. "I wonder," Aragorn said after a long pause, his words unfurling slowly, "if the burden you bear now changes not only your path, but your very shape within the world. There are winds, Gandalf, that seem to turn the leaves before they touch them. The forest behind us was still, yet when you passed beneath it, the leaves stirred." Gandalf looked at him sidelong, his brow lined not with anger, but with the quiet ache of understanding. "I do not know what I am becoming," he admitted, and the honesty of that statement hung between them like frost in still air. "But I know that I am not who I was. The ring does not speak to me in voices as it did to Frodo, nor does it tempt with images of conquest or fire. Instead, it offers silence, an unbearable silence in which I hear only my own thoughts, magnified, echoed back to me in perfect clarity." He closed his eyes, and the lines of his face deepened like carvings worn smoother by time. "There are moments when I feel its presence not as a weight, but as a companion. It listens, it agrees, and that is the most dangerous thing of all." Aragorn. Not that it seduces through strength, but that it appears to validate every fear, every noble impulse. It makes you feel right, righteous, even when your path begins to bend. Aragorn's gaze dropped to the earth, to the roots of the willow that wound like veins into the dark water. "There is an old saying among my people," he said quietly, "that the most dangerous lies are the ones you tell yourself in silence. I fear not the sword in the enemy's hand, half as much as I fear the calm voice in my own heart that tells me I have no choice but to wield it." They sat in silence, then the words sinking into the night, absorbed by the soft earth and the hush of the river. Above them the clouds drifted apart just enough for one lone star to shine through, clear, cold, and unwavering. "Tell me," Aragorn said more gently now, "have you asked yourself what the cost would be, even if you were to win? What kind of world would be built from such a victory? Would it not bear the mark of the hand that shaped it?" Gandalf did not answer at once. His eyes returned to the river, and in the flickering gleam of moonlight upon water, he seemed to see something that neither Aragorn nor any other could witness. Some vision, not of the world as it was, but as it could become. "I think of that more often than you know," he said finally, his voice softer than before. "And sometimes I see a world where war has ceased, where the races of elves and men and dwarves walk together without suspicion, where the dark places of the earth are lit and healed. But I also see a world where every corner echoes my will, where peace is enforced not by understanding, but by fear of disruption. A world where the birds still sing, but only the songs I allow." His voice cracked faintly at that last line, and for a moment the old wizard looked impossibly weary. The shadows beneath his eyes seemed older than the hills, and the staff in his lap looked more like a burden than a tool. Aragorn stood slowly, the weight of his own lineage pressing heavy upon his shoulders. He looked down at Gandalf, and for the first time he saw not the guide, not the fire-bearer or the wise, but a a soul caught between the edges of light and dark, bleeding into both. "If you fall," Aragorn said, "I will not raise a sword against you in hatred. But I will oppose you, not out of rebellion, but out of love for the world we were both meant to serve." Gandalf inclined his head, and his voice was but a whisper, almost lost in the wind. "Then may the world be strong enough to bear it." When Aragorn returned to the camp, the firelight touched his face with trembling gold, but it could not warm the chill he carried. Frodo stirred in his sleep, muttering, and Sam murmured something half-formed in reply. The night seemed endless, as though time itself had slowed to watch what might become of the hope it had once nurtured. Gandalf remained by the river, his silhouette carved in silver and silence. And behind his eyes the ring pulsed softly, steadily, like the beating of a heart that was not his own. The river carried them onward the next morning, slow and solemn as an elegy written in water. The boats glided like spirits across the Anduin's silver skin, their bows cutting quietly through the current which pulled them steadily southward, as though the world itself were guiding their descent into fate. The mists clung low to the river's surface, veiling the banks in soft uncertainty, and the trees that lined the shore stood tall and silent, their branches stooping like ancient elders bending over a cradle, whispering warnings to those who could no longer afford to heed them. Gandalf sat near the bow of the leading boat, his gray robes folding and unfolding in the breeze like restless wings. And though his staff remained at his side, untouched and unmoving, it seemed to hum faintly against the wood, as though it too had begun to feel the weight of its bearer's thoughts. His gaze was cast not at the water ahead, nor the shoreline to either side, but somewhere beyond the mist, beyond the veil of the future, to some far place where thought and consequence merged into shadow. His face was neither stern nor peaceful, but composed in the way a storm cloud might be before its first rumble, tightly wound, with an edge of sorrow almost too subtle to name. Frodo sat across from him, knees drawn close, fingers knotted in his lap. His face, once round and flush with youthful vigor, had grown thinner since their journey began, the lines of weariness beginning to trace his brow, like the first strokes of a sad artist's hand. He watched Gandalf with eyes that held too much history for their age, the kind of gaze that knew loss before understanding gain. And after some time, perhaps out of courage or fear, or something deeper still, he spoke. "Gandalf," he said, his voice quiet but not trembling, "do you ever wonder if we were supposed to find it? If the ring was meant to fall into our hands? Or if it was something else entirely? Some mistake that became a prophecy?" Gandalf turned toward him slowly, as though being drawn back from a great distance. His eyes, when they met Frodo's, were not harsh, nor glowing with power, but wide and tired, like windows dimmed by long years of waiting for a dawn that never came. "Every day," he said at last, and his voice was as the wind moving over a stone, patient, persistent, weathered by the very truths it carried. "I wonder every day whether the ring's path was woven by some guiding hand, or whether it has always been the weaver itself, quietly threading its way through hearts and time, choosing not by destiny, but by opportunity. There are times, Frodo, when I think that our choices are lanterns swinging in the dark, casting shapes that we mistake for meaning. And there are times when I believe the opposite, that even the smallest choice is a chord struck in the great music, part of a song that will only make sense when the final note is played. Frodo bowed his head, his fingers tightening slightly, his breath catching in the stillness. "And now you carry it," he murmured, not accusing, not questioning, but simply voicing the thought that had haunted him through sleepless nights and hollow dreams. "Does it feel different when you wear the weight? Does it speak to you?" Gandalf did not answer at once. He looked out over the water, where the mist rose in tendrils that twined like smoke, catching the light and fragmenting it into pale halos. Birds called from somewhere deep within the trees, but the sound was distant, blurred by the fog, as though the natural world itself had drawn away, uncertain of the presence it now carried within its boundaries. "It does not speak," Gandalf said slowly. "Not in words, not in voices, but it mirrors. That is its genius. That is the poison at the heart of its beauty. It shows you yourself not as you are, but as you might become, stripped of hesitation, clothed in certainty. It takes your deepest fear, your deepest love, and it offers you a world where both can be defeated or fulfilled with a single act. It offers the illusion of clarity in a world that was made to be complex. That is why it is so hard to resist, not because it threatens, but because it comforts." Frodo's eyes glistened, and he looked away toward the shoreline, where the trees shifted like dreams refusing to settle. A soft wind stirred his hair, and he felt the familiar ache begin again behind his heart. The ache that came whenever he thought of the Shire, the green hills, the clover-sweet fields, the sky full of birdsong and peace. And suddenly a thought came to him, unbidden and sharp. "What if it's not just the bearer who changes?" he whispered. "What if it changes the world to fit them?" Gandalf looked at him then, truly looked, and for a moment the flicker of a smile touched his face. Sad, slow, and full of that old melancholy wisdom that no longer came as easily to him. "Then the question becomes," he said, "who is the world becoming now?" The boats drifted on. Later, when they made camp beneath a canopy of ash and beech trees whose roots curled over the bank like ancient limbs, the sky had turned a molten copper, streth with the fading heat of day. The fire was lit, but no one spoke much. The silence hung between them like a thread they were all afraid to pull. Only Sam hummed under his breath now and then, some half-remembered tune from home, as he stirred a pot of stew that none of them truly hungered for. Merry and Pippin sat huddled together, exchanging quiet looks that held more unspoken fear than jest. Legolas stood at the edge of the trees, unmoving, his eyes scanning the deeper woods, though it seemed his thoughts had drifted beyond sight. Boromir sharpened his blade with mechanical precision, though his gaze often returned to Gandalf, lingering, measuring, and Gimli, ever solemn in moments of tension, merely watched the fire as though the flames might speak if he listened long enough. Gandalf sat a short distance from them all, his staff beside him, his hands resting in his lap. The light from the fire flickered against his features, casting shadows across the lines of his face that had deepened in the days since Lothlorien. The ring lay hidden, tucked within the folds of his robe, but its presence was palpable, like a warmth that never cooled, like the echo of a bell rung just beyond hearing. He was aware of them, not just physically, but spiritually. He could feel the subtle shifting of their trust, the way their thoughts bent ever so slightly toward caution when he spoke. He could feel Boromir's suspicion as a pressure behind his shoulder, Legolas's distance like a breeze that would not pass close. Even Frodo, sweet, broken Frodo, looked at him now with eyes that no longer saw only the wizard who had come to tea beneath the party tree. He closed his eyes and breathed deep of the night air. It smelled of ash and damp earth and wildflowers struggling to bloom. A beautiful scent, but fleeting, fragile, the kind of scent that fades even as you notice it. And in his heart, a voice, not the ring's, not exactly, but his own, rose like a tide. Is this what it is to lead? To walk a path no one else can follow? And to know that even those who love you begin to doubt as your steps grow heavier? Is it still wisdom if no one else can hear the truth beneath your words? And if the world needs saving, does it matter whether the hand that saves it is clean or trembling? The fire crackled. Somewhere in the trees, an owl called out, low and mournful, and Gandalf, sitting in the quiet heart of the night, felt something in him shift, like the turning of a great stone wheel beneath the earth, slow and terrible and final. Dawn came like a secret unburied by the wind, quiet, uncertain, and tinged with that pale sorrow that clings to the world in the hour between dark and light. The forest was a cathedral of shadows and dew, its branches laced with early mist, each leaf dripping with the memory of night. The birds, hesitant at first, began to sing their fragile morning songs, as if testing the world's willingness to begin again. The Anduin shimmered beneath the soft blush of morning, its surface wrapped in ghostly tendrils of steam, gliding like lost thoughts drifting over the face of the water. Gandalf rose early before the others stirred and walked alone through the waking woods. The trees here were tall and strange, their trunks wide and furrowed like the faces of old men locked in eternal thought. Moss clung to their roots like sleeping beasts, and beneath their boughs the light filtered through in thin golden shafts, catching the mows of dust and pollen in suspended dance. Each footstep felt heavy to him now, not from weariness of body, but from the silent pressure of thought that bloomed and tangled like ivy through his mind. He paused near a fallen log, its bark peeled back to reveal a network of silver fungus glimmering faintly in the half-light. A small beetle moved among the strands with quiet purpose, and Gandalf watched it for some time, his brows furrowed, not with frustration, but with a contemplative sorrow that had deepened in him since Lothlorien. He thought of the world, not just as it was, but as it could be, reshaped, restructured, released from the chaos of its own contradictions. He thought of the wild, unruly minds of men and elves, of dwarves and hobbits, each with their loves and fears, their pride and longing. He thought of how often their choices were made in haste from wounded places or blind desire, and how much suffering arose from the illusion of freedom when guided by broken hearts. And he thought more and more that perhaps the will of a single unyielding mind, a mind vast enough to see the shape of things, yet compassionate enough to love even the smallest bird, could save them all. But then, as if in reply, the wind rose slightly, rustling through the leaves with a dry, whispering sigh. The sound was not unlike weeping. It passed through him like a memory, stirring something older, something gentler. He closed his eyes and breathed deeply, and in that breath he remembered the stars above the Shire, bright and scattered, innocent as laughter spilled across the sky, and the scent of pipe smoke carried on summer winds. He remembered Bilbo's stories told by firelight in soft, meandering tones. He remembered music played on wooden flutes in Rivendell, and the way Elrond's voice carried history like a river carries light. These were the things he wanted to preserve, but at what cost? A twig snapped behind him, Not loud, but clear, deliberate. He turned slowly and found Boromir standing at the edge of the clearing, half in shadow, his cloak drawn tight against the morning chill. The son of Gondor looked drawn and restless, his eyes shadowed by something deeper than mere fatigue. "I thought you might be here," Boromir said, stepping forward, his boots sinking slightly into the soft earth. "You do not sleep as the others do." Gandalf inclined his head slightly. "Sleep is elusive these days. The dreams come too vividly now. They burn instead of soothe." Boromir hesitated, his hand twitching briefly near the hilt of his sword, not as a threat, but as a habit, a gesture of grounding. "I have been having dreams too," he said, "of the white tree of Gondor. It withers in shadow, its roots bleeding into the stone. I see the people crying out, and I see myself standing beneath the throne, my hands empty." Gandalf regarded him for a long while before speaking, the light through the trees now casting a pale halo around his shoulders. "You carry your father's expectations like a banner wrapped in chains," he said softly. "But the weight is not yours alone to bear, and yet I sense you believe it must be." Boromir's jaw tightened, and he looked away toward the river. "What else am I to do?" he asked, his voice, thick with the bitterness of devotion, turned to desperation. "My city stands on the edge of ruin. The enemy's hand stretches ever closer. Every hour we wait, every path that leads us away from Minas Tirith feels like another breath stolen from her lungs. I would give anything to save her." "And that," Gandalf murmured, "is what the ring hears. Not your words, but the silence beneath them. It knows your fear. It knows your love. And it offers a solution so clean, so immediate, that it feels like destiny itself." Boromir stepped closer, his brow furrowed deeply. "And you? Do you not feel it now that you carry it? Do you not see how it could end this war before it begins in truth?" Gandalf's eyes narrowed, not with suspicion, but with the raw ache of understanding too well what the man before him felt. "I see everything more clearly now," he said slowly. "That is both the gift and the curse. The ring grants sight, yes, but it removes context. It makes the solution seem obvious by removing the reasons we ever feared it. It offers power without process, victory without sacrifice. It promises peace, but not the kind born of understanding. It is a peace of obedience, a silence imposed, not earned." The silence between them thickened, pressing against the trees. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Boromir looked down, his shoulders sagging under the invisible mantle of love and duty and doubt. But what if the alternative is defeat? What if we lose everything because we were too afraid to act? Gandalf stepped forward then, placing a hand lightly on Boromir's shoulder. His eyes, once cold with reflection, softened, and his voice dropped to a near whisper. "Then we lose with honor, not with chains. Better to fall resisting darkness than to rise by becoming it." For a long time neither spoke. The river murmured on. A deer moved silently through the underbrush. The sun crested higher, casting dappled light through the leaves like spilled gold. At last Boromir nodded, slow and unsure. He turned and walked back toward the camp, not defeated, but changed, if only slightly. The fire within him, still burning, now flickered with doubt. not just in others, but in himself. And Gandalf remained beneath the trees, his hands still lifted, now touching the air where Boromir had stood. His face was calm again, but beneath that calm, something deeper stirred. An awareness that the tide was turning within the hearts of his companions, not because he had spoken falsely, but because the truth itself had begun to lose its meaning. The world, he thought, was no longer a place where right and wrong stood clearly at opposite ends. The lines had blurred, not because they had vanished, but because the fog between them had thickened, and the ring, patient and knowing, did not need to lie. It only needed to wait for truth to become too heavy. As the Fellowship drifted further south, the great river Anduin widened, its mirror-like waters now reflecting not only the sky above, but also the increasingly complex weight of the world unraveling around them. The air had grown thick with a kind of prophetic stillness, heavy with unspoken reckonings. The shores became stranger, their trees older and gnarled, their trunks stained with lichen like the scars of ancient time. The reeds grew in thicker tangles, whispering secrets to one another in the hush between wind gusts. Birds no longer called freely here. Their silences felt like absences rather than peace, like missing pieces in a melody once sung by a land that now held its breath. By day they rode through the glassy current, each stroke quiet as a heartbeat. By night they camped in watchful rings, their firelights subdued, as if even flame had grown hesitant to flicker too brightly in this place. Shadows clung more tightly here, not just in the corners of trees, but in their minds, in their thoughts, in the brief glances exchanged between companions who had once laughed together with open hearts, but now moved like figures drawn in faded charcoal, weighed by a history that had not yet occurred, but already hung like prophecy in the air. One evening, beneath the towering cliffs of Amon Hen, where the hills rose like forgotten kings from the riverbank, Gandalf stood alone at the edge of a promontory. From here, the lands of Gondor could be glimpsed in the far haze, their borders marked by distant mountains, cloud-wrapped and blue as dreams. The sky overhead had deepened into a swirl of purples and golds, the sun slipping behind the horizon like a secret swallowed whole. Aragorn approached slowly, boots brushing against the tall grass that swayed like a sea of sighs. He had not spoken with Gandalf since their last exchange beneath the trees, but something within him, a sense not of duty but of unresolved mourning, had drawn him up the slope to stand once more with the man who had become something more or less or other. Gandalf did not turn at first, but his voice emerged from the stillness like a bell rung far away, clear and resonant. "Do you see it, Aragorn?" he asked. "The edge of the world drawn not by the seas, but by the limits of what we dare to imagine. Gondor lies beyond, proud and trembling, a kingdom waiting to either be reborn or buried." Aragorn stepped to his side, his eyes narrowing as he followed Gandalf's gaze across the land. His voice came low and deliberate, shaped by generations of silence and exile. "I see a land that has endured more than most would believe possible. And I see a people waiting for a hope they've long since stopped expecting. But what I do not see is the path that leads there unbroken." Gandalf turned to face him now, and there was a strange calm in his expression. Neither serenity nor threat, but something in between. A calm that suggested the eye of a storm, or the hush before a decision that cannot be undone. "Because the path does not exist," Gandalf said, "not in the world we have known. There is no unbroken way from what was to what must be. That is the mistake the wise have always made. We think we can mend the tapestry with gentler hands, not realizing that the threads themselves are rotted through. The world needs not repair, but remaking. Aragorn's brow furrowed, and the wind lifted the edge of his cloak like a hand reaching from the past. "But at what cost, Gandalf?" he asked. "You speak of remaking as though the world were clay in your palm, but you forget that it is also blood and love and memory. It is not only the evil you would erase, but all the pain that taught us to be kind. Would you burn down the forest because some of the trees grow crooked?" Gandalf sighed, and the sound was ancient. "I would burn it," he said. "If the roots were poisoned and the shade no longer gave rest but sickness. Yes, even if it meant rebuilding one tree at a time, because hope cannot thrive in soil corrupted by centuries of fear." He looked out again, and his voice grew distant, almost tender. "I see it now, clearer than ever before. A world unified, not by swords or terror, but by understanding that rises not from debate, but from truth so pure it cannot be denied. A world where every tongue speaks peace, not because they fear reprisal, but because they no longer know the taste of cruelty. A world without shadow." "And yet," Aragorn said, stepping forward so that the wind swept around both of them like a shroud, "you forget that light without shadow is not vision. It is blindness. If you remove the dark entirely, you do not leave purity. You leave silence." The silence that followed was thick, full of everything that could not be said. The golden hour faded, and with it the outlines of the hills softened into dusk. Gandalf's eyes closed for a moment, and in that moment he seemed to age, not in body but in soul, as though the vastness of what he contemplated was finally pressing against the boundaries of his being. "I once thought," he said slowly, "that wisdom lay in guiding others to their own strength, that the best leaders were those whose hands remained unseen. But I have watched too many kings fail, too many good hearts falter, too many hopeful songs go unsung because those with vision refused to act. Perhaps, it is not mercy to let the world choose its own doom. Perhaps mercy lies in giving them a future they cannot yet imagine." He looked to Aragorn then, and for the first time his gaze bore the faintest gleam of command. Not arrogance, not wrath, but conviction. The quiet intensity of one who has begun to believe his own silence more than the voices around him. "You were meant to be king," Gandalf said, "but the crown you would wear is forged of doubt and history. I would give you a kingdom made new, not bound by bloodlines or prophecy, but by design. A realm not inherited, but deserved." Aragorn took a long breath, his jaw tight with restrained ache. He stared not at Gandalf, but at the horizon where the first stars now blinked into being above the edge of the mountains. "If you do this," he said, "if you take this path, know that whatever world you make, it will not be Middle-earth. It will be something else. And whatever man I am, I will serve that world only if it remains one where men may still fall and rise again by their own choosing." They stood in silence once more. Below the campfire burned low, and above them the stars shone colder than before. Night had settled over Ammonhen like an ancient shroud, embroidered not with peace, but with premonition. The hill upon which the seat of seeing stood loomed like a forgotten altar, its stone bones reaching toward a sky that had turned to burnished ink, pierced only sparingly by stars that trembled in their watching. The forest below had gone still, not with sleep, but with that breathless expectancy that overtakes wild places when something sacred is being trespassed. Every branch seemed to bend in listening, every leaf a silent sentinel, and even the river had grown hushed, as if the water itself feared what might be reflected in its face if stirred. Gandalf walked alone now, ascending the stone steps carved into the rock ages ago by hands long turned to dust. Each step echoed faintly, not with sound, but with memory. The kind of memory that does not belong to one person, but to the world itself. He had not spoken since his exchange with Aragorn, and though his face bore no anger, something within him had shifted, like a wind changing direction high above the sea before any sailor can sense it in the sails. He reached the summit where the great seat rose from the heart of the hill, a throne of cold carved granite ringed with empty stone windows that gazed out in all directions as though the world itself had been placed upon a wheel of judgment. He stood before it for a long while, unmoving, the stars wheeling slowly above him. When at last he sat, he did not do so as a weary traveler, but as something older, something called to reckon. And as he looked out, the world unfolded. A great sweep of Middle-earth stretched before his gaze, not merely as a landscape, but as a living organism, a map of pain and longing etched in forest and fire. He saw Gondor, proud, aching, its towers cracked and gleaming faintly in the starlight, holding their dignity like a man clutches a sword he no longer believes he can wield. He saw Rohan, windswept and restless, its people like reeds in a storm, bending beneath the weight of a future they could not name. He saw the ruins of Arnor in the north and the broken paths of Mirkwood in the east, and he saw the creeping blackness blooming like mold from Mordor. Sauron's eye, still searching, still summoning, still burning. But more than geography, Gandalf saw the hearts of men and elves and dwarves. He saw their hungers, their hopes, their grief. He saw their wars, not just with one another, but with themselves. He saw how even the purest intention, love of kin, loyalty, the dream of peace, could be twisted into cruelty by fear. He saw, and he began to feel not anger, but sorrow so vast it pressed against the edges of his soul. And then he felt it. The ring stirred, not with words nor visions, but with presence, a pulse, low and steady, like a second heart beating within his own chest. It was not seductive now, it was not flattering or coy. It did not tempt. It understood. It shared the view from the seat. It felt his sorrow, and it answered, not with comfort, but with a proposal. "Let me do it," it seemed to whisper, not in sound, but in that intimate language that lives just below thought. "Let us do it. You see the pain, you carry it, end it." Gandalf bowed his head, his hands gripping the arms of the seat. The stone was cold, but his palms burned with the pulse of the ring hidden within his robes. His mind reeled, not with fear, but with scale, with the terrible clarity that came when all possibilities lay before him like glass, and every future shimmered with both beauty and cost. A soft voice broke the silence. "Gandalf." It was Frodo, his figure small in the shadow of the stones, his face pale in the starlight. He looked up at the wizard, not as a follower, but as someone who had once believed deeply, fully, in the quiet strength of a friend. "You're changing," Frodo said. "I felt it for days now. Not just in how you speak, but in how the air feels around you. It's as though the world grows quieter when you walk, like it's afraid." Gandalf did not look at him at first. His gaze remained fixed on the dark lines of Mordor, far to the east, where a storm seemed always to brood above the blackened spires. "I have changed," he said, finally. "But change, Frodo, is not always corruption. Sometimes it is awakening. Sometimes it is the shedding of illusions. I see now, clearer than I ever have, what must be done." Frodo stepped closer, his hands trembling at his sides. "But that's just it," he said, and his voice cracked, not from weakness, but from the unbearable pressure of hope dying slowly. "It's not you I fear. It's what you believe you have to become. You were always the one who told us that power must be held lightly, like fire in an open hand. That the more tightly we grip it, the more it burns. And now you speak as if the flame should consume everything." Gandalf closed his eyes, and for a moment, just a moment, his breath faltered. A memory rose within him. Frodo at Bag End, wide-eyed and earnest. The ring barely more than a burden he could not name. The sound of birds outside the window. The kettle boiling. The world small and precious. "I remember," Gandalf whispered. "But the world was smaller then." Frodo stepped closer still, so close now that he could see the lines etched deep into Gandalf's face like rivers eroded by time and grief. "It's still small," Frodo said. "That's the lie, Gandalf. The world is too big to love in pieces, that we must break it to heal it. But the world is made of small things, quiet things. A hand held in fear, a fire in winter, a song remembered. You told me once that pity stayed Bilbo's hand, that mercy is not weakness. So why do you speak now of strength as if it were the only light left?" Gandalf looked at him then, and for a long, breathless moment, neither spoke. The silence between them was sacred, not absence, but a space so full of memory and meaning it could not yet be named. "I am afraid," Gandalf said at last, his voice breaking with a vulnerability that shook even the ring. "Afraid that if I do nothing, this world will drown. Afraid that if I wait, there will be no one left to choose. That if I let it unfold naturally, only the strong and cruel will remain." Frodo placed a hand on his arm. "And I am afraid," he said, "that you will save us from a world we no longer recognize, and that the peace you give us will be too heavy to carry." Far below them, the wind shifted. The trees murmured again. The stars above flickered, less like lights and more like eyes blinking. And for the first time, Gandalf did not answer. It was no longer just the wind that stirred in the trees. As the shadows grew longer and the day withdrew like a wounded animal into the refuge of the horizon, a strange tension unfolded across the land surrounding Amenhen. An invisible hand pressing downward, not hard enough to crush, but firmly enough to remind all who breathed beneath its sky that something vast and terrible had begun to awaken. The woods, once merely silent, now felt restrained, bound by something greater than fear. Even the birds, those sentinels of air and instinct, had flown farther inland, their absence not merely noted, but mourned by the leaves that no longer danced in response to their wings. In the camp below, the fellowship stirred uneasily. Boromir sat upon a stone, half in shadow, sharpening his sword with slow, deliberate strokes. The rasp of metal against wet stone, a sound as rhythmic as breath. Yet his thoughts were far from the blade. His eyes flicked toward the slope where Gandalf had gone, and there was in his gaze a kind of hunger, not for power in the vulgar sense, but for certainty, for the firm shape of direction in a world that was coming apart at the seams. He felt it in his bones, in the marrow of a soldier, bred not for philosophy, but for action, that the moment of decision approached not as a question, but as a wave, one that could no longer be postponed or denied. Across from him, Aragorn sat with his back to a tree, gaze tilted upward, watching the stars emerge through the branches in slow succession, as if they were choosing their places with careful deliberation. He did not speak, but his stillness was not the quiet of rest. It was the tension of thought held taut, like a bow ring drawn but not loosed. Inwardly, he wrestled not only with fear, but with the great burden of foresight, the knowledge that every step forward was now a divergence from the world as it had been, and every silence left unchallenged became permission for something darker to take root. He could no longer separate the man he was becoming from the world he might be asked to defend, if indeed defense were still the right word for it. And beside the fire, Frodo and Sam sat in murmured conversation, though it was not comfort they saw, but tethering, an effort to remain grounded, to remind one another that somewhere, somehow, the simple was still real. That soil still smelled of rain, that tea could still steep, that home could still mean more than a memory bruised by distance. Sam's eyes, ever watchful, flicked up the slope again and again, his expression caught between dread and devote. And then Gandalf returned. He did not descend so much as arrive, his robes trailing behind him like smoke, his steps unhurried, and yet each one landing with a finality that seemed to resonate not through earth, but through time itself. The firelight caught the edges of his form, rendering him briefly luminous, a figure cut from the cloth of storms. His face was unreadable, not because it was blank, but because it contained too much. Too many decisions wrestled with, too many doubts devoured and reshaped into resolve. Boromir rose first, half by instinct, half by necessity. His voice when he spoke was tight, not angry, but laced with that fragile urgency that comes when one fears they may already be too late. "What have you seen, Gandalf?" he asked. "What have you chosen?" Gandalf paused. The silence was not reluctance, it was weight. It was the drawing of a breath before a bell is rung that will echo forever. "I have seen the shape of the world to come," he said, not as prophecy, but as certainty. "I have seen the war that cannot be won by swords. I have seen cities fall not because they were weak, but because they waited too long for heroes who never arrived. I have seen the heart of men torn between love and fear, and I have seen how even love unguarded can be twisted into cruelty." Boromir took a half step forward. "And so you would claim the ring, not to fight Sauron, but to replace him?" "No," Gandalf replied softly but firmly. "To end him, and with him the need for thrones, for lords, for a world where power is measured by who bleeds less." He turned to Aragorn, who now stood as well, his hand resting upon the hilt of his sword, not in threat, but in mourning. "And you, son of Arathorn," Gandalf asked, "will you follow me? Will you see the world not as a prize to inherit, but as a wound to heal, with fire if that is what it takes?" Aragorn did not answer at first. The fire cracked behind them, and its light danced upon the trees like spirits seeking escape. He looked at Gandalf, and in his heart rose a grief he had not known he could carry. A grief not for what had already been lost, but for what now teetered on the edge of loss. That subtler, more sacred thing that gives shape to mercy. "I do not fear you," he said, and his voice was quiet but full. "But I fear what you believe you must become. You speak of healing, but healing does not burn. It does not command. It listens. It waits." Gandalf's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in something closer to pity. "And where has trust brought us? Look around, Aragorn. The lands are sick, the peoples are scattered. Even the elves retreat, leaving Middle-ease to wither beneath the weight of its own indecision. I am not asking for obedience." There was a pause then, deep and long, as if even the air recoiled. Frodo rose. His voice, when it came, was nothing more than a whisper, but it carried like a wound does, quiet and impossible to ignore. "Then we are no longer a fellowship," he said. The words struck, not like a blade, but like the fall of a tower, slow, inevitable. Irrend turned to him, and his expression shifted just for a moment to something old and aching, as if the memory of laughter at Bag End still lingered like smoke on his robe. "You broke yourself to bear it," he said gently. "I would not ask you to break again. But know this, when the world turns its back on mercy, it does not suffer slowly. It screams, and I cannot watch it scream any longer." He turned then and walked beyond the firelight, and the wind rose behind him. The world burned slowly, not in flame alone, but in silence, in the gradual aching eraser of nuance, in the soft extinction of variance, in the stilling of questions once asked in defiance of fate. It did not fall in ruin all at once, nor was it broken by a single act of war. No, Middle-earth bent before the will of a single voice, clear, steady, undeniable. A voice that spoke not in commands, but in absolutes, and in time, absolutes leave no room for the gentle contradictions from which beauty is born. Gandalf the Grey, no longer gray, no longer flame-bearer, no longer merely a wanderer between the wild hills and quiet hobbit doors, had become something else entirely. His robe no longer bore the color of twilight mist, but gleamed with the pale, unwavering light of a full moon, hung eternally in a motionless sky. He stood in the citadel of Minster, rebuilt not by stonecutters and hope, but by will alone. The white tower rising now like a sword drawn against the heaven. His staff had transformed as well, no longer gnarled and oaken, but smooth, silver-veined, tipped with a crystal that pulsed softly, like the eye of a star that never closed. Around him the city had changed, not visibly at first. Its white walls still stood, its banners still flew, its fountains still sang. But the people who walked the streets did so in measured silence, their faces serene, their eyes bright and empty. There was no hunger, no pain, no crime, but neither was there wonder. Children no longer asked why the stars moved. Artists no longer painted mountains that existed only in dreams. Even laughter had become quiet, efficient, fleeting. It was not fear that ruled here. It was agreement, universal, unspoken, unquestioned. And far beyond the walls of the new White City, the lands of Rohan, of Dale, of the Shire and Rivendell and Lothlorien had changed too. Some emptied, some restructured, some simply stilled. The ants no longer wandered, for the forests had been tamed. The elves no longer departed across the sea, for the seas themselves had calmed. Even the mountains had ceased to roar, their ancient protests muffled beneath the new order of things. The world had become manageable, ordered. And still in the throne room, Aragorn stood once more before Gandalf, but not as king, nor even his ranger. No longer clothed in the weight of legacy, nor with Anduril at his side. His garments were plain, weather-stained, and rough-spun like the earth he still loved. His beard had grown, stray with gray, and his eyes held the weariness of one who has walked too long on roads where every choice leads only deeper into memory. Gandalf regarded him with a sorrowful fondness, and when he spoke, his voice echoed not from the walls, but from the very stones beneath their feet. "You came back," he said, "even knowing there is no rebellion left, no cause unsullied by time. Why?" Aragorn did not answer immediately. He looked around the hall at its perfection. Clean lines, polished stone, no dust, no shadow. And he remembered the halls of Elrond, where time itself had once lingered, curling in the corners like smoke, where stories were told beside firelight and not beneath banners of decree. "I came," he said slowly, "because I once swore to defend the world, not the structure of it, but its soul. And even now I believe that soul endures, buried though it may be beneath your mercy." Gandalf closed his eyes. "You think I have slain the soul of the world? No, Aragorn. I have preserved it. I have saved it from itself. The grief, the loss, the endless tearing of kin against kin, all of it gone. The ring showed me the root of suffering, and I pulled it free. And in pulling it free, Aragorn whispered, you tore out the very soil in which joy grows." A long silence followed. Gandalf walked to the high window, and from there he looked down upon the city, its luminous paths, its immaculate domes, its gardens that bloomed without seasons. "There is peace," he said. "No war, no hunger, every soul in harmony." "But not in freedom," Aragorn replied. "You have given them peace, yes, but you have taken their right to choose, their right to be wrong, their right to struggle. You have stripped away the pain, but in doing so, you have hollowed out the joy that made it bearable. You have built a world so perfect, it no longer needs love." Gandalf turned back to him, and in his face was something new, not anger, but weariness, vast as the sea. "Do you know what it is to see 1,000 futures and watch them collapse again and again beneath the weight of mortal failure?" he said, voice rising not in volume but in depth, as if it reached down into the bones of the world. "Do you know what it is to carry every death, every betrayal, every orphaned child, every burned village, and to know, truly know, that it could have been prevented if only someone had the will to say no more?" Aragorn nodded, and his voice came softer now. "Yes," he said, "I do. But I also know that grief teaches compassion, that imperfection teaches humility, that mortality with all its sorrow is what makes us reach for one another in the dark." A sudden wind swept through the chamber, though no doors were open. It circled them both, pulling at robes and hair, as if the very world were leaning in to listen. Gandalf stepped forward. "Then what would you have me do? Return the ring to Shadow? Give back the world to chaos and chance? Let the innocent suffer once more, simply for the sake of choice." Aragorn placed a hand to his chest. "I would have you remember who you were. Not a god, not a ruler, but a guide, a voice among voices, a bearer of flame, not its master." For a long moment they stood thus, two figures caught in the eye of an unmoving storm. And then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, Gandalf's hand moved to his chest. The ring was there. It pulsed, not violently, but with steady rhythm, like the beat of a heart too long unheard. It shimmered faintly in the light, not gold, not red, but something deeper, a light that flickered not from the metal, but from the soul behind it. Gandalf looked down at it, and his eyes filled, not with tears, but with the knowing that precedes them. "I wanted to save them all," he said, and his voice cracked. "Not like thunder, but like a father's whisper at a bedside." "I know," Aragorn said. And Gandalf wept. But the ring did not fall, and the world did not change. Not again. Not yet. The stars above continued their cold procession across a sky too still to remember wind. And far to the west, where the sea touched the edge of dreams, something ancient stirred and turned away.